Hey guys, today we're going to learn some genetics vocabulary. Vocabulary is very important in genetics, and if you don't understand the vocabulary, it makes everything much harder. So we're going to take a little time and learn that vocabulary today that you'll be using for the next several lessons. Some instructions. You'll want to pause the video on each slide after I go over them so that you can write down the information. You only need to write down the definitions for each word. And the definitions I put in yellow text to make them easier to know what to write down. And finally, you may want to write down all the other information as well if you think it will help you remember, but it is not required. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First word is genetics. Genetics is the study of how traits are inherited through the interactions of genes. So remember, you have a pair of each chromosome, and on your chromosomes are genes. So you have one copy of each gene on each chromosome. And so those two genes interact with each other to determine your different traits. So a trait is a way of looking, thinking, or being. Traits, we're only interested in traits that are genetic and are passed down through the genes from parents to offspring. And some examples are hair color or type, height, personality. So to give you another example of traits that are genetic, if someone was born maybe with a genetic disease that caused them to not have a hand, that would be a trait that we're interested in. However, if a person was to lose their hand somehow, maybe they're in an explosion or something caused them to lose it, that would not be a trait that we're interested in genetics because that doesn't change their genes and it can't be passed on. A gene is a section of DNA that controls the traits an organism has. And remember, as I said a little bit ago, genes come in pairs and offspring inherit one copy of each gene from each parent. So you can see in this picture, it kind of shows you that cells have chromosomes in them. Chromosomes are come in pairs and they're made of DNA, and then a section of that DNA is a gene. Heredity is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. Right, phenotype. Phenotype is the outward physical appearance and behavior of an organism. So when you think of a trait, you're probably thinking about what they look like. This is the phenotype. Genotype is an organism's genetic makeup. So this is actually how the DNA is coded and what types of genes they have and how they interact with each other. But we typically represent the genotype by 2 letters. So in reality, a genotype is really like a long string of bases. But to simplify it, when we're analyzing these things, we represent them by 2 letters. So that it could be a capital and a lowercase, it could be 2 capitals, or it could be 2 lowercase. An allele are the different forms of a gene for a specific trait. And these are represented by letters. They can be capital or lowercase. They're capital when they're a dominant allele, and they're lowercase when they're a recessive allele. We'll go over those next with the difference between those. So you can see here, I'm just showing you that there's 2 chromosomes. On each chromosome, there's a different version of allele, one represented with a capital A and one represented with a lowercase a. All right, let's talk about recessive. Recessive is an allele. A recessive allele is an allele that is hidden by the dominant allele for that trait. So if you have one recessive allele and one dominant allele, you will not see the recessive allele. So it'll only be expressed when there is no dominant allele. So if you have 2 recessives, you'll see that trait. Otherwise, you won't. And we represent these with a lowercase letter. So again, we choose pretty much any letter we want. We try to choose letters that look different, capital and lowercase, but there's no strict requirement on that. And a dominant allele is an allele that hides the recessive allele for that trait. the dominant allele is always expressed. So whether there's 1 or 2 copies of it, it will always be expressed, which means you'll always see that form of the trait. And these are shown by a capital letter. Again, any letter you want to use is fine. Try to pick things that look different, capital versus lowercase. Sometimes for an assignment, I'll tell you to use a specific letter. All right, so here's just kind of an overview of all that information. So you see on the left here, a capital A is representing dominant. It is the dominant allele for flower color, so this one is purple. White is the recessive allele for flower color, and it's represented by a lowercase a. So if you have 2 copies of the dominant allele, capital A, you'll have a purple flower. If you have 2 copies of the recessive allele, lowercase a and lowercase a, you will have a white flower. And if you have 1 copy of each, capital and lowercase, then you will have a purple flower.